lot of the ways that people critique the Bible is on the basis of the King James, especially, and a lot of other versions as well, but most of the King James. And I've gone over before the fact that almost all Bibles, even the King James, are based upon their Old Testament is translated from the Masoretic Text, if it's translated from original languages at all. They use the Masoretic Text. And the problems with the Masoretic Text are many and serious because of the bias of the translators, the Masoretes. Masora means traditions, and these people did their translation several hundred years after Christ. Obviously, before, I think it was also a couple hundred or so before the King James Version. And the problem is, as I've mentioned before in other videos, that they wanted to obscure messianic prophecies. And that I've mentioned briefly before about the fact that they would mess with the timeline in order to make sure that Jesus couldn't fulfill things. And after the previous video, I think was Waterworld, a kind viewer recommended a video, which I have linked in the description, that does a great job of explaining how the Masoretic Text changed timelines. So this is a detail you might want to look at that video. It's only about a half-hour long. And there have been other videos I've done, not so many on the Old Testament, but a few lately especially. I kind of got into that when I did the ones on Babylon, but we also have not only the Waterworld one that I linked in the description just so you could see also the link to the comments there, and I have in this description the link to the video I'm talking about. And I grabbed a screenshot. The top part of this image here is something I had from a long time ago, but the bottom part is a corrected timeline. And I will try to zoom in a little more on that top one. I just wanted to show the difference, and I have to be careful when I scroll this, because if I just use the mouse wheel, it'll go to the next picture instead of rolling down the image. And I don't know if you can see this. It's really hard to read the words because they're kind of distorted and not very high quality. But this goes from Adam and gives the timelines that were fairly accurate in the Masoretic Text. Any of the text, those can be cross-checked with each other and verified until you get to Noah and Shem. And the problem is Shem. Okay? So as you can see in the standard timelines, and even the video points out that the creation sites will use this incorrect Masoretic timeline, that Shem appears, let me roll that this way a little bit. This is Shem, the son of Noah, appears to have outlived at least two of his son and grandson, at least two generations. Now, people will say, well, he was born before the flood. But if it's the conditions of the flood that shorten lifespans, then this shouldn't be true. But that's not the main reason that this is in question. The main reason, whoops, I did it. I wasn't going to do that, and I did it. Habits, scroll wheels, and all that. Let's go back here, I think, to where I was. And this was Shem that lived after Noah, and this is what's in error. So let's go down here to this one. Let me see if I can stretch that out a little bit more. There's Shem. And his son, Arphaxad, which you can see here. These lifespans aren't too bad, but it's the Shem lifespan that they messed with, because he died before Arphaxad died, in reality. And it has a trickle effect, of course, on all the succeeding generations that came after Shem, because everybody's off by quite a bit. Well, how much? So let's roll down here. Now, this is from this chart, the blue chart, and this one here are from that video that I have linked in the description, recommended video. So there's Arphaxad and the succeeding generations. And this is what the Masoretic Text has for their ages when certain things happen. This is what 3 other witnesses have: the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the historical account of Flavius Josephus. All of them add 100 years to these ages. All of them, all 3 have 100 and whatever. What the Masoretic Text shortened Hashem's lifespan by 100 years, because it throws everything else off. If you want to mess with the timeline, you go back as early as you can, and before the flood wouldn't make a whole lot of difference. So they started by knocking off 100 years of these early generations after the flood. Okay? And critics will use that, as I mentioned in the description, will use this error perpetuated by Bible scholars, which all foolishly relied upon the Masoretes to tell them these things. Because, these errors are seen as, people who are actually looking for problems are most likely to find them, and people who blindly swallow what the Masoretes and the rabbis said are not going to look for errors, are going to accept it as true. And so when they come to these ages, you got to look before the Masoretes. And this is what we find. The Septuagint and these other 2 witnesses show a consistency that indicates the Masoretic Text, which came much later than all of them, is an error, and deliberately so, because they consistently knock off 100 years from these ages. So this is a big deal, because if Christians don't know this, our critics do, because they're looking for errors and we're not a lot of times, not always, but this video is a good example of people who are Christians who are looking for these errors and not blindly swallowing the Masoretic Text, which, as I've said before, it not only means traditions, it means Talmudists. This was the same group that started in the intertestamental period, several hundred years before Christ. And one of the reasons that I think prompted the Septuagint to be made is because the Hebrews were going astray, so to speak. They were in exile and had completely lost their minds. And you'll find in Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament accounts of people trying to restore the scriptures, and kings ordering translations made to help them with that, believe it or not. And so this is what gave rise to rediscoveries of the older text, and they were in disrepair, so they had to be rewritten and translated into the common language, which this was about the time of Alexander the Great. And so, among other things, it was done in Greek, and we also have the Samaritan Pentateuch there especially. Josephus lived after, but before the Masoretes. Okay, Josephus lived just after, or slightly contemporaneously with the life of Christ, because he was, I think it was just after. I think he wasn't born till about 100 AD or something like that. I forget exactly his timeline range, but he was right after the time of Christ, but before the Jews had even gotten around to making their fake Greek version, because it took some time for the Jews to realize that the Christians were using the Septuagint to show that Jesus was the Messiah. And at first they tried with their own Greek version, but that didn't catch on. So eventually, after a few hundred years, the Masoretes got together and made a Hebrew text. And they took that opportunity to make sure that they could hide Jesus permanently from and all the Old Testaments that would be translated from it. And that's what happened. And apparently, for whatever reason, the Christian scholars just accepted it as true, even though the Jews had made sure that their Savior had been killed. They had trusted them when it came to the Bible because they thought they had ultimate respect for it, but they don't. As I've mentioned before, and I can no longer find the video anywhere, there was a modern day Pharisee about, I don't know, at least 5, maybe 10 years ago, that showed how Pharisees think. And he was being honest about it and saying, look, this is how they would view when God gave them the law. God gave them what we excuse me, consider the Old Testament, they decided that since God gave it to them, that not even God could tell them what to do with it anymore after that point. Once God gives you something, it's out of his hands and he has nothing to say about it anymore, and they can do with it as they choose. That's the mentality from a Pharisee telling us what the Pharisees think about very nitpicky, pedantic things about how the Bible works and how God works, and that their respect for the Bible only comes from respect for themselves. Okay? And yes, just a brief, touching off something in the chat there. These are the people who make codes. These are the people who make the Kabbalah. These are the people who will tell you that, the code seekers, especially, whether Jews or not, will look at the Masoretic Hebrew text and make up all sorts of things out of it, codes and counting letters and so forth. Well, I can believe that the Jews would arrange things that way, but we don't have the original Hebrew. We do not have Paleo-Hebrew text in any great quantities. So how can you make codes out of it? And if you do make codes out of the Masoretic text, you're making codes out of the people who monkeyed with the Bible. This is why I don't put stock in Bible codes. Okay, so this is something that Christians need to understand, first of all, because the critics are going to jump on it. And when it comes to Bible codes, make sure you're not using really any of the Old Testaments we have very much of. And if you don't have the whole thing, you might as well forget it. Because this is the monkeyed with text. This is the altered, obscured Messiah text. And this timeline with these other ancient witnesses is exactly one of the ways, I did it again, but this is the one I wanted to look at anyhow, one of the ways that they mess with the Bible's message of when the Messiah would come. And yes, they would have the motive to do that because they believed that the Bible belonged to them and not to God anymore. And their respect, as I said, was not for God, but for their own traditions and teachings. So this timeline is the one that's correct. And this timeline is the one everything else will depend upon when it comes to how many years something happened. How many years ago something happened, and whether Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. So we got to know this stuff, and if we don't, we're opening ourselves up to the critics, as I said in the descriptions of the video here. Okay? So know your Bible, but know also you got to go looking for research that's been done that challenges the Hebrew, Israel, Jew, Rabbi, Pharisee version of things. Okay, because this opens us up to the critics. And while I keep scrolling through these things accidentally, I might as well keep going. I keep using my mouse wheel. This is some maps and things I've collected about where Israel was originally, all sorts of interesting stuff if you look for it. And it goes, as I've said, this kind of touches on something that we were doing over at Flat Out Elected too the other night about a bunch of ridiculous claims about either for or against the Bible that people make. And one is the Black Hebrew Israelites, and they would have to have lived in this area. This is the Great Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and this is the original land of Israel. This is the Salt or Dead Sea right here. We have the Jordan River on this side, and we have, bounded by the sea on that side. It's not at the north as it would be in northern Africa. Okay, we also have this area, the wider area of the patriarchs. So here's Israel and northern Egypt. So you do get into the north part of Africa here, but it's certainly not the land of Israel. This is the land of the Egyptians. Okay, the Babylonians were over here. The Hittites were up here. People used to think the Hittites were fictional, and then they found artifacts, and you can study their language in the universities today because the Bible always turns out to be true. The topography is unmistakable, and this is how you identify areas. And northern Africa, or even especially southern Africa, which the Black Hebrew Israelite movement tried to say is true Israel, is just not. There's no way around it. It's a prophecy timeline. Here was that, I had stretched it out so we could see it better on the one I just used. This was the old city of Jerusalem. There's a model of the ark, which with a freight train beside it for scale. And how it had layers and was a really big barge. It didn't have to be a sailboat or anything like that, with a giraffe neck sticking out the window at the top. This was a huge thing. They had to have room for grain. They had to have room for probably mostly baby animals, because why bring the full size? More maps and charts that I have. These are missionary journeys in the New Testament. And this was that other one that I got from that video that showed how the Masoretes, in their effort to hide the Messiah from the Old Testament, or from the, fulfilling the Old Testament, knocked off 100 years off these descendants of Shem. And this is what they do. I mean, they're the people most likely to change the Bible are the ones closest to it. Okay? This is why when you get into Bible versions debate, that you get into the issue of who had motivation to do what. And what people tend to do is mostly they tend to add because of copyist errors, where they put notes in the margin and then somebody else comes along later and says, I think that's part of the original text, not a side note. So they put it in. That's most of the time how errors creep into a text. So you get additions, which is why the King James has more stuff in it than modern versions, because the modern versions went back to the originals and said, hey, this stuff isn't supposed to be there, and they took it out. Not because they were trying to hide the Messiah like the Jews did, but because they were trying to honor the Bible by being as accurate as possible. And even the King James writers didn't think they had the best version. They just did the best they could with what they had, and they knew they didn't have all the material they needed. So, I guess this is mostly just one aspect. This video today was just one aspect of how people misunderstand the Bible, and sometimes it's our own fault. Going back to this chart I made today. So just to put those together, I'm trying to, I guess that's not getting any bigger really, but that's all three of them together. This being the most common one you'll find of timelines that get suddenly shorter after the flood, which people have always attributed to different conditions, but that would also have to have applied to Noah's son Shem. Yes, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were all born before the flood, but if it's the conditions, once again, that cause people to live shorter lifespans, then that would apply to the survivors of the flood as well. But it didn't, and they're significantly shorter all of a sudden. And the problem is that Shem's lifespan was artificially extended. Look how long this is. I mean, he goes back to, let's see if we match this up with Jared, and not that far from Enoch. Okay, Enoch's life was relatively short because he walked with God and was taken and he was no more. And he lived, I think it was 365 years, and was taken soon. But not that many generations from, let's see, where's Noah over here? Okay, Noah, according to this chart, lives the same time as Enoch. And yet afterwards, with Noah's son, let me find it again, it's hard to line these up, Shem, that's where the Masoretes changed things. And here we can see, once again, the Bible talks about 2 or 3 witnesses. We have 3 witnesses that say that the Masoretes that came after all of them were knocking 100 years off of every one of these ages. Okay, that's the kind of thing they were in the habit of doing. And that's how they do a time warp. Which is why I called the Hangout time warp, because they're messing with time. People talk about the time-space continuum and time being bent. You can't bend time. You can't, because time is not a physical thing. Time is just an abstract construct that we use to mark sequences and durations of events between, one event and another. And just like Tesla said, how can you bend space? How can you bend nothing if space is nothing? So neither time nor space can be bent or warped or traveled. Things happen when they happen, and if you weren't there when they happened, you can't go back there. And so only God can really see the future, and some spiritual entities are given some information, I believe, but only partial. And so, and they will lie and twist it as well, and they only have partial information. So be careful who you ask about the future. But the point being that a time warp is only something that happens when people try to change the past with historical records. And in this case, the Masoretic Text, which I've talked about many times before. We had not only the Waterworld video, but also there was one, I can't think right now what I called it. It was another one on the Old Testament, and a testament to the truth, that's what I called it. So although the vast majority of my videos are on the New Testament, these Old Testament issues are important, and I've tried to tell people before that just because I focus on the New Testament doesn't mean I don't value the Old. But this is one of those ways in which the Old is important, because it's an overall defense of the faith against critics inside and outside the faith. Okay. Now let me take a quick look at the chat here. Hello to anyone who came. I did try to say hi to a few of you anyway. As far as the name of Yahweh, I've gone over that before in other videos. I don't remember which ones, but I've made note of the fact that if you really want to know about names of God, you go to to a Hebrew interlinear on the passage of Moses and the burning bush. Okay, because in that incident, God talks to him, and Moses says, Elohim, what is your name? Okay, so Elohim was not a formal name for God. It was a generic name, just like the word God is in English, has become a generic name, although it wasn't always. It is now the way we use it, and people 1,000 years from now might look back and say, God, oh, they meant the God of the Norse, or the God of the whatever, you know, people. No, that's not what we meant. We use it generically. And so we make that mistake, though, looking back in time, and people will look at Elohim and go, oh, this was the name of such and such particular God. And no, by the time of Moses, it was a generic name, because he says, Elohim, what is your name? That's like saying, God, what is your name? Which God are you? That's what Moses was asking. And you know that if you look at the Hebrew, and you can look at it with an interlinear. And I believe I have links to that in my website somewhere in some of my older videos. But look up Hebrew interlinear. There's an interactive one. Look on feather.net, and you will find, I think, in the resources, a Hebrew interlinear under the tools, I believe it is. Anyway, he says, Elohim, what is your name? And Elohim answers, I am the God, or I am who I am, is what he says first of all. I am who I am. And it is abbreviated in the Hebrew Masoretic Text, because that's the one you'll get in that interlinear, is a Masoretic Text. But even so, that's the one the critics are going to use. He says, I am that I am, and it's abbreviated YHWH as far as English letters are concerned, YHWH, and it stands for I am that I am. It's an acronym, okay? And so it's not a formal name. It is not Jehovah or Jove or Jupiter. It is an acronym. And then he says, God goes on to say, tell the people of Israel, I am has sent you. And then he goes on to say, also tell them that I am the Elohim of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. So God identifies himself by whose God he is, because that's what Moses was asking. Who are you? What God are you? What Elohim are you? And he says, I'm the Elohim, the God of this line of people. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, grandfather, father, son. Jacob being Israel. That line, the line of the promise, that is whose God he's saying he is. Okay? So he's identifying himself by whose God he is, and by the fact that he is the self-existing one. You can take I am that I am as meaning I am the self-existing one, and that Elohim is a generic name, and so has nothing to do with any other religions. He's identifying himself by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's what I think of the name Yahweh and all that. Yeah, they were generic names, just like El was a generic name. And you'll find El, like Elohim, and all sorts of El words in the Old Testament and in other ancient documents, because that was a common word. I mean, sometimes these arguments that the critics make are like saying that because the is used in a particular other language, something like the, then in English it means that instead of just a connecting word, and a very, very, very common connecting word. It's a definite article in grammatical terms, definite article, the, that particular. And people don't know what they're doing when they do linguistics, when they say things like stupid arguments like there's no J's in the Bible. First of all, they're thinking of only the King James as the Bible and only the Catholic Church as Christianity, which are two huge errors. But secondly, they don't realize there were no English letters whatsoever in the Bible. Their English was not a language for hundreds and hundreds of years after the Bible. Okay? Early English was something that kind of grew out of Germanic languages. It's an Indo-European family of languages that English came from. And Hebrew and Greek long predate English. And so, of course, we don't find any J's. We don't find any English letters whatsoever. Some of them appear like English letters, but they're not. For example, the letter A, alpha or alpha in Greek, shaped the same, because English came later and borrowed these shapes, just like Phoenician, was one of the earliest written forms of a language, not a, there were cuneiforms and other pictograms sort of things, and that's what letters grew out of. Even in Hebrew, like I said, the Paleo-Hebrew and Phoenician, they have shapes that are somewhat familiar. The Greek letter sigma, we're mostly familiar with the capital being that angled, zigzag that they use in math mostly, sigma. That's the capital S. But there are two small letter S's in Greek. One is used in the middle of words. It looks like an O with a line on the top, a tangent line going off to the right. But at the end of a word, that letter changes shape, and it's more like the familiar English S shape. And it has the S sound. But there's no relation to English because English came much later than Greek. So we have to be careful with the silly arguments about letters, as if this proves anything about the Bible being written by Jesuits. There's another J word, and Jesuits didn't even exist till 1540. And so the Jesuits, no, they did not write the Bible. They may, who knows, have had someone of their number on the committee of translation for the King James. But here again, the Bible predates the King James by a lot. We have fragments in the New Testament from 150 AD. And we have the Dead Sea Scrolls are from BC. So how can people think that the Jesuits wrote the Bible or the Romans wrote the Bible? The Bible predates all of them. The New Testament was contemporaneous, but it was written in Greek, and the Romans at that time had zero interest in what the Christians were writing. And here again, we get into the fact that even the Church of Rome, knowing, if you study Roman Catholicism, that their traditions take precedent over the Bible, then why would they want to change the Bible, or why would they want to write it if they're trying to suppress it? Both of these things can't be true at the same time. The Roman Catholic Church puts its traditions over the scriptures and its magisterium over anyone else's interpretation, and so therefore trying to say that they wrote or changed the Bible is contradictory of the fact that they put their traditions over it anyway. They hid the Bible because they wanted to supersede it. Why would they write it and then hide it? Doesn't make any sense at all. So the critics don't know what they're talking about, and yet they consider themselves experts. Anyway, that all came from, the names of God, because that's an argument critics make. Yeah, it does not mean devil. Yahweh does not mean devil. Yahweh is just a way of vowel pointing YHWH, and I'm using English terms and letters for what the Hebrew words, Yod and so forth. I don't know Hebrew very well, so I'm not going to try. But they are based upon errors and misunderstandings and deliberate twisting. Yep, you can find a lot about the Masoretic Text, which is wrong, and I did that in my previous video. I think it wasn't Waterworld, it was... which one did I do that? Oh, well, anyway, one of my recent videos. Yeah, Jove, Jehovah, and so forth. Hallelujah was not invented by Satanists. No, it does not mean praise Lucifer. Yah is an ancient Hebrew word for God. There were other ancient, this is again, all the ancient languages are not spoken or written in vacuums. They had distinctions, but they also borrowed from each other. This is what languages do. English is fraught with foreign words. It has a lot of them in it. And it means God save or something like that. Something, I forget exactly, but God save us. That's what, or no, that's what Hosanna means, sorry. But praise to God. Anyway, Yah means God. It does not mean Satan. It does not mean praise Lucifer. This is ridiculous. No, I know you're not saying these things, Mike. I'm just saying that I'm saying that to the critics who make up these ridiculous claims that these are, and here again, people take a word sound, like sun and sun is a perfect example, S-U-N-S-O-N. That similarity only works in English, and the words, as farther back you go, get farther apart in sound and spelling. And people can't just take a sound or a spelling and march through cultures and times and languages and think they're finding a common thread. That's like, as I've said before, trying to work a connect the dots picture without paying any attention to the order given by the person who made the connect the dots picture. They don't have any clue what they're doing when they're doing these connections of words and sounds and things like that. They just don't know, and they get all the material from other people who just don't know or don't care what the truth is. So yeah, that's ridiculous claims that they make. And so if you want to find out the truth, at least ask Christians too what they think of those sounds, because if you only ask one side, you're not likely to get the whole story. And this is why all my life I've spent looking outside the Bible as well as inside. People think I never looked outside the Bible, and they still make that claim today, even though I've done videos and written blogs and all these things. They think I never been out of my house, but they're wrong. So anyway, okay, yeah, and you went and got the Strong's number. The H, if anybody doesn't know, stands for Strong's Hebrew number 3050. I only use them and reference them in my Greek interlinear because of convenience and the fact that it helps identify particular root words. And other than that, I don't put a lot of value in Strong's, and no Bible scholar does. Strong's is a concordance. And they did eventually make what they consider a dictionary, but if you want a really good lexicon, you go to something like the Liddell and Scott, or the Bauer, or the BGAD or BDAG, I forget what the order is, Bauer, Gingrich, whatever. Those are decent lexicons. So Strong's, like I said, is good for reference and for identifying roots, but that's about it. Anyway, they are accurate most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time, at least will give you a quick dictionary lookup. But here again, remember what a concordance is. On any writing, a concordance references how words are used in that writing only. Strong's is keyed to the King James. So it gets all of its dictionary meanings from the King James, from the way the King James translators used it. That's what a concordance is. That's why it's not a dictionary or a lexicon. So if you want a full range of meanings in the way words were used outside of that text, which you need to do for context, you have to look at a dictionary or lexicon. You can't use a concordance. Anyway, it's handy in this case. It gives a quick meaning which does not conflict with the dictionary. That's something you just have to check. But that's what God means, and what Yah means, sorry. It means... Let's see, you've got some stuff here this is from Strong's, I guess, from the Hebrew words. Yeah, things that gods in general did in those days. So, like I said, people will take a snippet of something or a part of something and run with it and make up a new story. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly which writings you're talking about there. Let me see if the scroll jumped on me again. Anyway. Yeah, that's another good point in the chat. Chat there. Let me roll up a little bit farther. Yeah, find a lexicon. You can find, like I say, the Liddell, Liddell, and Scott. There are 3 versions of that, but they're not conflicting. They're just small, medium, and large. Basically, the exhaustive one is the full-size one. I have what's called the middle Liddell. It's the medium size. It's pretty good, but not exhaustive for all, because the Little Scott, which some people use as a critique against it, considers classical Greek, historical Greek, and not just Bible Greek, okay? And that's why they don't like it, but that's part of the context as far as I'm concerned, so I use that one. Thayer's is okay. It's another good one, but it's not, I think it drops the ball in a couple places, but it's half decent. It has some good points. And yes, Jesus is the name that is hated, not Yah or Yahoshua or any of these things. People hate the name of Jesus. I mean, people have driven out demons in the name of Jesus with the J. People have stopped so-called alien abductions if they were marginal Christians. You have to belong to Jesus to bear his name. So they would call out to Jesus. Or if you're calling out for him to save you, that works too if you're unsaved. But if you're just trying to use the name Jesus as a talisman or a defense against evil forces, that's not going to work for you. But it's the name Jesus with the J that has stopped some of these abductions, and people are saved by calling out to Jesus with the J. So people who don't like the name Jesus are showing more how hostile they are to the real Jesus than anything else. So that's a good point in the chat there. But no, Yahweh is not a tampered with Masoretic word. And if you look at the Septuagint, it is translated as most of the words for God are translated theos, as it is used in the New Testament. Theos is the generic Greek word for God. And in case anybody wants to disagree, we should point out that the word Zeus is found a couple of times in the New Testament in the book of Acts, where people mistook Paul and Barnabas for Zeus and Ares. And so the word Zeus is in there, so they were not confused or borrowing Zeus in Jesus, because the word name Zeus as the false god is in the text by itself. So they were not using it generically. They were saying that these people were mistaking the disciples for their gods, and one of them being Zeus. So when we use the name Jesus, we should also know that the letters for Zeus in Greek are completely different from the letters in Jesus, which is I-E, S-U-S, or whatever endings, depending on the part of speech, because they did not leave proper names alone in Greek. If it was, the object of a preposition or whatever it was, the ending could change. So you might have theos, theon, theou, but they all are from the same root, which is typically the lexical form. They call this what you'll find in a dictionary, which is usually the singular masculine, and it is theos. So that's what you'll find in any dictionary, but they are all referring to the same entity, and it's not Zeus. And Jesus is not Zeus. This is provable, as I've said, from the New Testament, in the fact that Zeus is a completely different word in Greek, and it is mentioned separately as a false god in the New Testament. So that's how language really does work, as opposed to the way the critics use it. And even, like you said in the chat, there are some Christians who just don't know better for whatever reason. I mean, we've all been down the road learning as we go, and so some people just, I guess, haven't done enough research yet, and they write about what they know because they want to share it. So I don't ascribe any ulterior motives to those people. I just think there's a little bit more that they need to look into. Let's see, looking at the chat again. 99 names for God in Islam. And, well, the thing is, one thing they don't call God in Islam is love. They don't believe, they don't care whether God has any love except love for those who, only are serve him, if they use it at all. I'm not even sure they do. And hatred for those who don't bow to the sword, as the Muslims spread by force their religion. If they can't spread it by persuasion, they'll use force. That's the example of Muhammad. But anyway, Jesus called himself the I am, and the door out of illustrations. He said I am because that's what Yahweh, Elohim, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, called himself. I am that I am. And Muhammad heard stories from caravans telling him about the Bible, and he mixed and mashed things. He got Mary, the sister of Moses, mixed up with Mary, the mother of Jesus. He got all kinds of things wrong. So yeah, you're going to hear some overlap. But again, Islam wasn't invented until the 600s AD. And these names for Jesus go back, of course, to the 1st century AD, and I am goes back, 1,000 years before that. So the Muslims are borrowing. It's not the other way around. Okay? The Muslims take from the Christians. They post-date Christianity and Judaism by a lot. Let's see. Name from the word, John 17. Let's see. Yeah, here again, they in the Quran does not teach that Jesus is the Son of God. They believe that God has no son. They believe that Jesus was not put on the cross, that instead he was taken down and Judas or somebody else was put up there instead. So they deny the substitutionary atonement of Christ. They deny that he was the Son of God. They think he was just a prophet and that Muhammad is a greater prophet than Jesus was. So here again, I mean, even New Agers will use the word Christ as in Christ consciousness and think it means the same person. No, they think Christ is an idea rather than a title that means the anointed one, the Messiah. That's what Christ means in Greek. Why they would use the Greek word, I don't know, because it suits their purposes. But, they won't say Messiah consciousness. They won't say anointed consciousness. They only use Christ. And this is a tell on how disingenuous the New Agers are. But here again, the names in the Bible, in the Quran, you have to ask by description who this person is. The Jesus of the Quran is not the Jesus of the Bible, because the Jesus of the Quran did not rise from the dead and is not the Son of God. So I don't care what they call anybody. You have to know them by description, which is why at the burning bush, God said, I am the Elohim of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. That God. And the real Jesus of Christianity is the Jesus who is the Son of God, who lived a perfect life, died for our sins, and rose again. That Jesus. Okay, so you have to ask who, and which Mary, and so forth. Let's see. Etymology, if the new race only found fragments of a written word. Yeah, actually, octopus, octagon, they're all from the root word octo, which means 8. But octo what? Yeah, legs, octopod, means pod is an older word for foot. Octagon being angles, I think, 8 angles. Anyway, there are similarities but again, you have to find out the meanings by the immediate context of where they're used. And if they match, they match. And if they don't match, they don't match. And we can't just go by the sound. But yeah, things that would be found 1,000 years from now, like I was saying about the word God, they will mistake, just as they do now for things that happened thousands of years before us. Yes, October was originally the 8th month. November was the 9th, and December, Deca, was the 10th. The 11th was what we now call January, which is the Roman god Janus that looks backward and forward, and the 12th month was actually February. The first of the year was the spring, and that's where the Hebrew calendar originally began too, is in the spring. It makes sense to start a new year in the spring when the world comes back to life again, so to speak. That's when it makes sense to have a year begin. And so originally by our month names, that some are named after pagan gods and some are named after their ancient numbers. And Octo was the 8th month because the year began in the spring. So yeah, sometimes there are word associations you can do, but you have to do it by research and not just by sound. And that's what the critics do, is by the sound. Okay. I don't know about adding months, but just changing month names and deciding that the year started at a different time because they were honoring the god Saturn and so forth, and Janus and all these people. And yeah, so it's kind of our month names are kind of a mishmash. And for the Julian calendar, of course, they would begin with Janus and Roman, the Roman year, as opposed to the more ancient year and the Hebrew year, which began in the spring. Let's see. See, August, I don't know, probably. I haven't really gone deep into month names. I just, snippets that I come across in other studies. Yeah, about Jesus calling out. Well, that's here again, like I said, they have to be seeking God. And sometimes the Muslims will be seeing the real Jesus in a dream, and they'll see the nail prints in his hands and so forth. And the hand in Hebrew and Greek in the ancient times included the wrist. So everybody pretty much agrees the nails were through Jesus' wrists, which was considered part of the hand. And anyway, that's the Jesus they see, and they turn to Christianity as a result. Because if it was the Jesus of the Quran, they wouldn't change religions. So they're seeing the real Jesus, and they weren't even looking for him. But God knows what hearts are open to receive the truth and what aren't. And so he can do extraordinary things to people who need extraordinary things. For example, you can't even, you're not allowed to preach anything else but Islam in those places. And even in Israel, you cannot preach the gospel. So God has to use other means. We can't always smuggle Bibles in, and there, may be missionaries in places where they're not known to be missionaries. They have jobs and they do regular things, but they bring the gospel with them because that's what Christians are called to do. And so they wind up being missionaries, and they have to be careful that they show how different the Jesus of the Bible is, for example, especially to Muslims. But that's a very dangerous thing to do in Islam. At least in Israel, I think they either just throw you in jail or throw you out of the country. But in Islam, in Islamic-controlled countries, they'll just either A, charge you an exorbitant tax for not being Muslim, or B, they will torture you or take all your stuff or kill you. That's what Islam does with unbelievers, especially if they refuse to convert. They're often slowly beheaded. And that's, another thing about the fact that the powers that be have promoted Islam, the radical, actually the true Islam. If you look at the Quran and you look at the Hadith and you look at the life of Muhammad and his successors, they were quite violent and bloody about spreading their religion, whereas Christianity were the victims of persecution, not the instigators. Real Christians, even at the hands of the fake church and even at the Reformation, the powers of the religions are often the ones who turn against the true believers. The so-called radicals who are actually practicing what the scriptures say, these are the ones, the Christians who actually practice it, have been the persecuted group. And so it is with Islam. If you take the Quran and the Hadith and so forth as examples and truths, you're going to do the radical thing. You're going to do what Muhammad did, which is to lie, cheat, steal, and kill, and torture and enslave to spread your religion until there are no such things as non-Muslims. That's what they mean by peace. They do not coexist. It's ironic that the first letter in the coexist sticker is the crescent moon of Islam, and they will never coexist. It's just the irony of starting with the religion least likely to blend. Anyway. Yeah, religion of peace is the religion of death, as they define it. Just as you always have to ask for definitions, because just as in Mormonism, when they say there is only one God and only one way to be saved through Jesus, what they mean is that's this world only, or this universe only. They believe in either multiverses or multiple worlds where there are people, and they are governed by absolute gods of other realms that are producing spirit children to populate their worlds that they make. They believe this is one world or realm of many, and that the God of the Bible is just the God of this realm, and they're being good so they can be gods themselves. And if they're good and obey this God, then they will have their own planet or universe and be gods of that. And of course, you have to be male to qualify, and your spirit wives will spend all eternity being barefoot and pregnant. And that to them is heaven. It's a man's heaven only, and just like Islam is only a man's heaven with the 72 virgins and all that, where it's all about male flesh and exalting the masculine and treating the feminine as something worse than animals most of the time. And even the Talmudists did that. The Talmud is full of misogyny. So Islam and Mormonism have a lot in common if you actually study the details about golden plates and angels and the prophet person being counted worthy to correct the errors of the churches. There's so many parallels. It's like between Freemasonry and Islam, that's pretty much where Joseph Smith got Mormonism. So this is just, you know, if you do the study and not just listen to either the critics or the proponents, and this is where we get, you know, the apologetic and polemic are two sides of the same coin. An apologetic defends and a polemic attacks. You have to listen to both sides. You have to listen to them more than once and go back and forth between them until you're satisfied you know the whole story, because each side is going to try to poke holes in the other in their argument. So it takes work, and not everybody either has the time or the inclination for that. But if they don't, and they want to even try to either defend the faith or attack someone else's, they have to do some study, or at least look up studies that other people have done. I mean, I've done a lot of that. I am knowledge scavenger. I look for things. I go looking for what, you know, and weighing everything, and not just picking out what appeals to me, but weighing all the sides and then picking what makes most sense and what seems to add up best to the evidence. And this is, you know, the chart that I've had up all this time is one of those instances where I really didn't have the tools or the interest or the time to go looking into the lifespans of Old Testament patriarchs. But someone else did, and although I've looked up these things before, it was someone who commented on my previous video that said, hey, look, check out this half-hour video that's really blows holes in the Masoretic Text. And like I said, I've done that before recently in one of my videos, that about the fact that the Masoretes wanted to hide the Messiah, wanted to hide that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. And so there's a whole bunch of areas on a whole bunch of levels that you have to do research if you really want to get to the bottom of things and find the truth instead of just endlessly looking for it. We went over that the other day at Flat Out Elected, because people get upset if you say you have the truth if you're a Christian. They're not upset if you find the truth if you're an astrotheologist, for example. It's all well and good if you say you found the truth, but if you're a Christian, you're not allowed to say you have the truth. That's their bias and prejudice that comes out all the time. So this is another red flag of what the truth is, because the truth is the most attacked. Just as conspiracy theorists are attacked by the mainstream and just as flat earthers are attacked by the conspiracy world, so also Christianity is attacked by the flat earthers. They say, oh, no, we tolerate all faiths, and we have Christians at the conference, and we have this and that. But what they don't seem to be aware of is all the Christian hate, the Christophobia going on in the chat rooms and the other hangouts, where Christians are just mocked and reviled, and the Bible, one person in one case simulated urinating on the Bible. And it was ironically a self-proclaimed Christian who didn't think anybody should get upset about that. And the Christian who did get upset was reviled and screamed at by the other so-called Christian, who thought the one who stood up for God's honor was the one who was not a real Christian. But go figure. Anyway, there is rampant push against Christianity, even by, as I've said before, the big channels that started out in flat earth by blasting the Bible, by mocking Christians, and by making a lot of these errors, such as no J's in the Bible. The Jesuits wrote it, the Romans wrote it, the King James is somehow the only Bible, and there, nothing happened before that, or that Shakespeare or somebody wrote it, the Jesuits wrote it, whatever. This is all based on lies, slander that is being spread about the Bible and Christianity. And I even had one time, about 6 months ago, when I was in a hangout, and one of the big infinite plane proponents, who suddenly hit the ground running with hundreds of viewers and thousands of subscribers, and nobody batted an eye. They just all promoted him and interviewed him and praised him upside one side down the other. This person started out with 8-hour lectures about what's wrong with the Bible and Christianity, and then they came to a hangout where I was with 2 accounts at the same time, shouting in all caps that I worship the Pope and worship, the Jupiter and all these ridiculous false claims. This is the hatred of Christianity that has permeated especially the flat earth community since its inception. And people who don't see that just aren't looking. It is a fact. Yes, there have been token Christians, or at least Christians that aren't afraid to call themselves such, which is commendable. But at the same time, they put it on the back seat when it comes to conspiracy research, especially flat earth research. It's like, well, I don't want to upset anybody, but the astrotheologists don't hesitate at all to upset people. I mean, they call us fools. They say we believe foolish things because the Bible is a code book. And I just mentioned earlier about the fact that they're basing their codes on the rabbis and the Masoretes, the Talmudists, not God, not the real Bible. And the hatred and the bias is just undeniable. If you look, there is rampant anti-Christian bias in the flat earth community. In a chat just the other day, somebody said, I will not allow, they hated all the Christians, and there have been videos made since the conference, the flat earth conference, that they are not going to allow Christians to take this over, and they're going to get rid of the Christians, and, you know, that we should just all disappear, to put it kindly. They want us out. So anybody who says flat earth is friendly to the Christians is only looking at a very small part of flat earth. You know, the flat earth so-called community, which right now is splintered and eating itself alive because people, you know, not only about different models, but about personality issues and who's a shill and all that. And that then these same people will turn around and criticize Christianity for having denominations. So there's that double standard again. But anyway, wherever we go, and even if they do push us out of their communities, they can't push us out of the truth. We have the truth. Jesus is the truth. And they're just pushing away the truth and showing that truth isn't really what they're after. Okay, they believe that the creation is more important than the creator as well. And that's something we have to remember. This isn't about how God made the world, but what God made the world. The only true God that made the world. As Christians, that's our highest priority, is identifying the real creator. It is not the bumbling demiurge of the Luciferians and Gnostics and New Agers, okay, which are all branching from Babylonian Luciferian doctrine. Let's see, the claim that Luciferian calls to try to manipulate, tamper with the teaching. Yes, and from the chat there, for people who aren't going to see the chat. I should put the chat up, I suppose. I never think about that, and I'm probably about to end, but let me see if I can pop out the chat, first of all. It's the easiest way to share it is to pop it out. And just wait for that to come up, and then I will try to screen share that. There we go, present. It's not very big. I suppose I could try to blow that up, but I'm not sure it matters too much at this point. But this is helpful for people who aren't here when the hangout is live. They can go back and look at that. So yeah, we haven't had much activity as is typical for my morning hangouts, but these are the things that were brought up in the chat. If like I said, if you're watching this later. And so we have our work cut out for us as Christians. I think is the point to be taken away from all this, that there are people who have different specialties in research, and we should try to find those people. And here again, you know, when some people will say that because I've spent so much time in the New Testament that I don't know the Old, or I don't care about it, and they don't understand that, they're burning a straw man. And there's also, while I'm thinking about it, there are people who say that God, you know, if God was real, he wouldn't have done things the way he did them. Well, first of all, how do they know that? God is not defined by what makes sense to people today in the English-speaking world. That's just not how it works. And if people want to say the Bible is not ancient, well, here again, they're just believing what they want to believe, and they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater by dismissing all of history beyond present genealogies that maybe their personal memory goes back 3 or 4 generations of things they can verify somehow, that nothing must be true beyond that. That is solipsism. That is, I'm the God of my own world. That is the most narrow-minded religion of all. And it will not lead you to truth. It will lead you into your own enclosed echo chamber, and you'll believe whatever you want to believe. That's the blue pill. Solipsism is the blue pill. If you call yourself by an ism, there are people who do that. They call it their name ism, or they believe that truth is whatever it feels like to them. That's solipsism. That's the general term for that kind of belief. And it will lead you only inside your own echo chamber. And syncretism is related in that people develop what they decide to believe by treating everything they find as a smorgasbord or buffet, where they pick out the stuff that personally appeals to them. Even though the other food is really good food at a buffet, if they don't personally want it, like it, or in the mood for it at the time, they're not going to pick it out, and they decide that those things might be true for someone else. Well, that's all well and good until you get to Christianity, when they say, no, you're wrong. You know, even though everybody has their own truth. You Christians cannot have your own truth. You're wrong. And you're wrong because you think you're right and everyone else is wrong, even though solipsists all think everyone else who has ever lived is wrong. It's hypocrisy on every level. But anyway, so I've had part of the chat up there, and I'll scroll that down a bit, just so this is, in the recording. And I'm probably missing some things right now, but not a whole lot. I am getting ready to wind down, I think, but kind of gone all over the map, pun intended, but as far as Bible maps and things I was showing earlier. But anyway, the point being about a time warp is that timelines are often inaccurate for legitimate reasons, but when you do a lot of searching, you will find out the truth, and the truth is that the Masoretic Text is not reliable when it comes to Bible apologetics. You've got to go to these other witnesses because they predate even, the Masoretic Text, which was made around 400. They started on that around 400 AD to combat Christianity. That's why they did it. Any Christian Bible should not use the Masoretic Text, or they should at least correct it with these other witnesses. And some will do that with footnotes. But in my opinion, the main thing should be that they take all of the text into consideration and only use the Masoretic when the others either conflict and they need a tiebreaker, or they just, have done some, other research, archaeology, whatever, and try to piece things together. That's what anybody else is going to do with any other ancient writing. And we want to know the truth, so we shouldn't be afraid of that. But we have to also keep each of those other things, the other witnesses, in their context. And that's what the critics don't do. Anyway, let's roll down the chat a little bit more. And we already went over the month names and things like that. Calling on the name of Jesus. The morning voice. Oh, man. That's very nice of you to say. I'm sorry about any inconvenience, but this is, like I said, this is just the time of day that works for me. Nice quiet house, and before I get my stuff going for the day, I put off my chores too, so don't feel too bad. But yeah, it's, and this was something I wasn't even sure I was going to do anything today, and this didn't pop into my head till just now. It's like, I watched this awesome video the other day. I really should share it. So somehow I've stretched it to an hour. I don't know how. The video itself was only a half hour, but I go astray and I try to address things in the chat. Let's see. Yeah, everybody tries to tamper with it, including the Jews and sometimes Christians. They have tampered with the New Testament. I've said before about the United Bible Societies, UBS, which I'm continually mixing up with USB, like a United Serial Bus for computers, or UPS, the delivery service. There's too many acronyms that are similar sound. But anyway, the United Bible Societies, for a long time, I think it was back in the 50s or so, decided, as I've gone over before in my equality series, that Junia mentioned in the letter to the Romans, the chapter 16, that she is called outstanding among the apostles, or noteworthy among the apostles, and they couldn't abide the fact that a woman was called an apostle that Paul was speaking so highly of. So they did a gender bender on Junia and decided that she must have been really a man. And there was no masculine form for that name until the Middle Ages. And that's where that lie arose, that this must have been a man, because prejudice comes first. As the say, there's crude sayings that, basically say, males before females. But they changed it in the Greek text to a masculine form that did not exist, so they broke their rules. They were supposed to be the guardians of accuracy of the original Bible language text that were used for all other translations. And that's, here again, a choke point. When you have a control committee, all you have to do is control the committee. And they also broke their own rules in not getting what's called attestation. They did not have anything in antiquity to go by to justify changing that to a masculine form. So they perpetuated a lie that stood for 50 years, that Junia was really Junian or Junius, I forget which is the masculine form, and decided that this was a man so they could say there were no female apostles. Well, they, again, they couldn't hide, especially as information age got really going, they finally grudgingly changed it back to Junia, but modern translations, even today, will put a footnote, say, or Junius masculine, or whatever, Junian, I forget. but they'll say masculine. They'll put it as a footnote alternate reading because they can't let it go, even though they broke their rules twice to do a gender bender and back again, reassignment surgery on poor Junia, just because they couldn't abide a woman being an apostle. And so since then, they've made up some other ideas that I won't go over into right now to brush away the fact that there was a woman apostle. So the New Testament gets mangled as well, but we have too many people watching to let them get away with it, and they have to rely on translations and say, well, what Greek college did you go to? Just like doctors today will say, what medical school did you graduate from, even though you can prove that certain things are really bad medicine. But I'm not going to get into that either. Anyway, you got to be careful when it comes to the text, and that's one of the reasons I did that New Testament translation. It's like, I'm going to gather all the material I can gather and look into pros and cons and this prejudice, that prejudice, and play them off against each other and see what the truth is to the best of my ability. And that's why I did that, because of monkeying, especially with the New Testament. So anyway, let's look at the chat some more. Omniscience means to never, if omniscience means to never learn anything new, then how can we make free will choices that God did not determine? Yeah, omniscience means just knowing everything, omni, everything, and science, knowledge. This is the early, and people make that mistake, the King James only is science, so falsely called. In the Middle Ages, science meant general knowledge. That's all it meant. Knowledge, it should be translated today, not science. Science is a particular narrowed meaning that didn't used to be so narrow to mean the scientific method, ideally. Of course, that's not what they actually practice, but technical things, you know, things that require higher education, that kind of science. That's what it means now. Did not mean that in the Middle Ages when the King James was made. Anyway, to know everything. But I think what you're getting at there in the chat is that the Calvinistic idea that God can only foreknow things because he causes them, which is, like I've said before, doesn't require any foreknowledge at all, because if you rig a game so that you always win and then predict that you're going to win the game, that's not a prediction at all. That's rigging. And that's not what God does. God knows because he sees, because only he can see into the future. Nobody else can. And he is the one who, you know, as it says, and I forget the exact reference, I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me. I state the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. And I will do all that I please, etc. It's in that passage. So that idea of knowing is the opposite of causing, because otherwise there's no point in saying you know it. That's just how I see it. All right. Hello, more people in the chat. And yeah, also they will take our behavior, and that's why I keep trying to raise the bar, and why everybody seems to be, you know, not everybody, but most people will say that I'm a bad Christian because I don't act like a chameleon or a doormat or a punching bag when I'm among non-Christians. I stand up for my faith, and they don't like it, so they call me a bad Christian. Therefore, they hate Christianity because we're rocking the boat. We're not succumbing to the Hegelian dialectic and giving up essential truths to come at a third false way. And they never are the ones who reach across the aisle. They want us to do all the reaching. They want us to do all the compromise, and want only Christians to be ashamed of what they believe in, to the point where our beliefs have to we have to sit quietly while other people like astrotheologists and solipsists blatantly spread their religion all over the place, and nobody bats an eye because that is not offensive to them. People don't see what's hypocritical about allowing their personal religious spirituality beliefs and marginalizing and mocking and criticizing ours, only ours. As I said, the big channels started out that way. One of them has ism in the name, where they, and another is an infinite plane channel, where they started out bashing Christianity. And then they talk about unity and peace and love. And if you say, look, I object to people, you know, such as another channel, a third one, saying, you know, that regularly has an astrotheologist on saying that we're keeping religion out of it and you shouldn't object to this person trashing your faith up one side and down the other. They got really irate at me for that, for standing up and saying, no, I'm not going to be a part of that. I'm not going to be a part of anything that marginalizes my faith or drags Jesus' name through the mud or burns the Bible in front of me. I'm not tolerating it. And if they push me out, they push me out. I don't want to be a part of that group. Okay? Or any of those groups. And as long as the official so-called orthodox representatives of Flat Earth, for example, want to treat us that way, or they claim to give lip service by having a few Christians among them, that's fine. They can do that, and they can think that's tolerant. But when they also, some of those same people, turn around and turn a blind eye to the hatred of Christianity and the promotion of solipsism and syncretism and astrotheology, that's a double standard, and I won't put up with it. Okay, anyway. Yeah, it's like an illustration I've had that I wish, I don't want to take the time to go look for, that I've mentioned just the other day of, it was about misogyny. But it's the same principle here. And you see this cartoon divided in half, and on the left half you see two stick figures, and one has drawn a long math problem on the chalkboard, and the other one says, wow, you're really bad at math. And then the other half of the picture, the one doing the math problem is a girl, and the one critiquing says, wow, girls are bad at math. You see the bad logic there? The double standard. In the first case, it was just that individual who was bad at math. But in the second case, oh, you're a girl, then all girls are bad at math. And they do the same thing to Christians. You know, if they meet a particular Christian who isn't real good at logic or real good at science or whatever it is, they'll say that all Christians are bad at that. They paint us all with a broad brush. They say they all worship the Pope, even though most of us aren't Catholics, you know? Any real Christians I know, most of them are not Catholics. Don't consider myself a Protestant either, because of the things I've learned about the Reformation. I'm a biblicist. I follow what the Bible says. I'm a Christian in that I follow the Christ, the real one. I'm a truther. And so when people say that all Christians are this, all Christians are that, they don't know what they're talking about, because we're not all Catholics. We're not all Protestants. We don't all pay homage to the Pope. I've had people who think they know the Bible inside and out say such things and talk about the letter J and so forth. It just boggles my mind, and it's to the point where I'm so frustrated with that level of blindness and hypocrisy that I don't even want to talk to them anymore. Sometimes it's tempting, though, and then I regret it. But anyway, it's not because I don't have a good argument. It's because they don't, and they're so against rationality and fairness that I can't even deal with it anymore. I'm tired of it. So, yeah, that is a good point also in the chat, that not even all Catholics care what the Pope says. You know? They even see, you know, the church can do what it wants, but I'm just there for this reason or that reason, and I'm not making any statement at all about which Catholics, you know, but I'm not saying that all Catholics are unsaved either. I'm saying that's true even in Protestant churches. There's a lot of unsaved people there because of falsehoods that are taught. And many of them are against what the Bible says, Protestant and Catholic. But the Catholic Church in particular, I believe, is the latest manifestation of the Babylonian religion, and they just learned to put on sheep's clothing is all. But as with the fact of history that the Catholic Church tried to hide the Bible that they did not write, or they wouldn't have hidden it, so also they wound up preserving the Bible for us in a way, even though that wasn't their intent. So also the gospel gets out in spite of Catholic official teachings. Okay? There is a lot that people do that is counterproductive, and I have a special problem with the Catholic Mass because, at least historically, I don't know what they do now, because I'm not intent upon micromanaging the Catholic Church theology. I concentrate on the truth rather than what I believe not to be the truth. But anyway, it historically has been that they teach that the Mass is an actual re-sacrifice of Jesus' body and blood. Only they call it an unbloody sacrifice, even though supposedly the priest says magic words that turn the wine into actual Jesus' blood and the bread into his actual broken body on the cross, which, you know, he didn't have broken bones, so why are we chewing him up? But anyway, this is where we get the phrase hocus pocus from the Middle Ages, when people would hear these Latin words and not know what they mean, but they were told that it magically turned ordinary bread and wine into a physical body and blood, and so they equated hocus pocus with magic. The common people weren't as dumb as they're led to be, portrayed as. But the point being that I don't believe the official Catholic position has changed on what they consider the Mass. And this is against the New Testament. You cannot put Jesus back on the cross. You cannot re-sacrifice him. That is a slap in his face because it means he didn't do it right the first time. And there was no point in him doing this at all if we have to keep doing it over and over. And this is what the whole book of Hebrews is about. Once for all, he brought that sacrifice to the temple in heaven of his own blood. Not his body, his blood only went to heaven. And that this is the one sacrifice for all. That's what Hebrews says over and over, once for all, once for all. And this is why I have problems with Catholic theology. It's not Catholics individually, it's their theology. And there are Protestant churches that have a theology that's almost as bad, if not as bad. Anyway, let's look back at the chat again. Let's see. Yeah, it's always a double standard against Christians. And let's see. Initiation, yeah, I gets into it a lot of times too. Abracadabra, I don't know about. It may be Kabbalistic, but also you have different branches of the Kabbalistic teachings. You have the Jewish branch and you have Gnostic branch, and even though they all do wind up being the same common ancestor, that's the only time I can tell you I could believe in some sort of evolution is religiously, spiritually. There is a common root, the common ancestor of all false religion, of course, began in the Garden of Eden with the temptation of the serpent, you shall be as gods, but that's where it developed in time formally with the Babylonians, I believe was the first major formal religion, the ancient Babylonian religion. And that's why I did that video about Babylon, and then a follow-up called Daughters of Babylon, where we trace all false religion and all religious practice to them. And that what was told to the Israelites, to Moses, giving the law and all that, was a correction of not only what the pagans were doing, but also a prophecy, a type and shadow of what was to come, and it was fulfilled in Jesus, which is why we don't need to do that anymore. And so here again, the Catholic teaching of re-sacrifice is negating the cross of Christ and making a mockery of it, whether they realize it or not. And here again, you have to take motivation and understanding into consideration. But this is why we get into Babylon, and when we're at Flat Out Elected, we're hoping to do another episode tonight. Eventually, we'll get into the discussion of Babylon and how God tells people to come out of her so they don't share in her plagues. And I think this refers to the false religious system, and that this will in some way involve the Vatican and the papacy, regardless of the individuals holding those positions at any time in history. That institution is, I believe, going to be playing a major part in Bible prophecy soon to come. So, yeah, there could be a connection on the words there in the chat. But like I said, if we can get people together probably sometime this afternoon in Eastern time, we will try to do another Flat Out Elected hangout on Revelation. And there's going to be some interesting stuff, even though we're not very far along, and we may only get a few chapters forward. I hope we are going to get into the sealed judgments and some very interesting stuff there. So anyway, today's thing on Time Warp was mostly about the fact that the genealogies of the Old Testament, be careful where you get those, because if you get them from the Masoretic Text, you will be led astray. And I can almost guarantee you that every Bible critic that goes to the Old Testament is going to the Masoretic Text, because they don't know any better. They don't look much at the other witnesses that support the Bible, other translations of the Old Testament from before the time of the Masoretes, but they will look at other ancient religions and put those above the Bible and interpret the Bible through that lens, that bias. So anyway, it's all a big mess, but I do my little bits, and those people aren't going to watch my videos, but at least you guys know. Let's see. 70 nations, 70 gods. And there is a statement in the Old Testament about that has been mistranslated by the Masoretes as Let's see, I don't remember the reference, but something about that the nations, as they spread out, had their divisions and their boundaries according to the number of the sons of God, whereas the Masoretic Text has the number of the sons of Israel, which makes no sense at all because there were only 12 sons of Israel, and there were many more nations than that. It makes more sense to say the sons of God, which is a reference in the Old Testament to angels, and these angels were probably some of the fallen ones in some way, or their descendants, the Nephilim, the disembodied spirits, the demons, who posed as the bases for the heathen pantheons. This is where you get national boundaries and why there were regional gods. I think there's a tie-in there. But the number 70 is certainly significant, and whether it's an actual number or a symbolic number is really beside the point, because nobody can prove one way or the other at this point in history. But there are principalities and powers, yes, and they are, they have particular numbers, and some of these numbers come from Enoch. You can take that for what it's worth. But as I said the other day, pointed out by the article I was referencing on Waterworld, the Hebrews did not care about the mechanics of creation or the specifics of geography and things like that beyond the land of Israel, because what mattered to them was the heart, and that's something that we Christians have to. The whole purpose of the Bible, and the purpose especially of the Christian faith, is who is the creator, who is the one true God, and not how he made the world or what shape it is or anything like that. The main thing about the shape of the world is exposing lies, such as the lies that we've ever been to the moon, or the lies that the governments or the historians, that the media are always telling us the truth. They're rarely telling us the truth. And if it's not something that, anything that can be twisted is twisted, and that's certainly undeniable. There have been many false flags like 9/11 and so forth, and Bay of Tonkin and whatever, anything you want to name, Bay of Pigs, all those things, all those false flags, and they happen on almost a daily basis now. But the point is that truth is what it is, and there is truth to be discovered, or there's no point in looking for it. If everything in the past is a lie, then nobody who says that is allowed to go to the past to try to find anything out, including the Bible. If they say the Bible is a pack of lies, then they're saying that anything they refer to in the past is a lie, which means the truth is undiscoverable and changes from one minute to the next, which is very much like that Mandela effect fatal flaw in its belief, is that the truth is undiscoverable because they can go back and change the facts and change history and change evidence. And if people who believe those things are being hypocrites when they say the Bible is false, because they have no way of knowing. And I've even seen people say both things in the same sentence. The Bible is false, and we really don't know what happened back then. How can one person said that in one chat? We don't know what happened back then, but I'm sure the Bible is wrong. Wow. And this is why I don't bother talking to a lot of people anymore. It's madness. It's stupidity and blindness and self-delusion on an unimaginable scale. So anyway, if you're a person who values evidence and rationality and the scientific method, you're not going to get along well in today's conspiracy world. That's all I can tell you. So I'm going to get off here and get some things done, get a drink, and you all have a nice day, and thanks for coming. We'll see you all later.